The Industrial Revolution. Brought to you by Sara Zatek, Sidney Kakabar, Madeline Hoffman, and Carter Vitez. The Industrial Revolution began in the year of 1760 with the initiation of the Enclosure Acts. The Enclosure Acts were the consolidation of land that removed farmers' rights to keep the land that their families had owned for generations upon generations. Poor farmers were typically unable to pay the costs that came with keeping their land and were forced out, their pieces of land being given to wealthier farmers. Typically, the farmers were offered other pieces of land, but it was usually smaller and less prosperous than what they had previously owned. Relief came with the invention of the Jethro Tull machine, which was able to drill seeds with a machine, rather than going by hand, which was much more effective. Global agriculture increased drastically with the advance of new chemical fertilizers and pesticides. This time period was called the Green Revolution. However, life did not only change for farmers during this time period. Britain became the first industrialized nation because they built businesses and created new jobs. For example, Britain was able to build factories, canals, and institute parliamentary enclosures. As a result, they experienced rapid urban growth and traded frequently. Coal and iron played a major role in Great Britain's Industrial Revolution. Technology also served an important role. Some improvements occurred within the new textile factories. Before this time period, handloom weavers were common, but they were now being replaced by factories. One of the main textile factories was wool. However, the UK passed a ban on it in 1721. Railroads also were a very big step into the Industrial Revolution. They were able to connect urban areas with rural areas, showing the lower class that they could do things that the upper class could too, making the world look like a much smaller place. Railroads were also a much faster form of transportation than horses that typically took days. Cities, therefore, became majorly overpopulated and created many different problems, one of them being the Great Stink. This was when people in London refused to leave their homes due to a horrific smell coming from the River of Thames. The river was the city's most vital water source, as was now being filled with waste. Eventually, the smell became so unbearable that Parliament unwillingly had to fix it. At this time, Parliament was terribly self-absorbed. They wanted to make temporary adjustments to the river instead of spending their own money to actually fix it. Instead, they were able to, build a whole new Parliament building for themselves. Life in the factory was harsh. Workers worked for 12 to 14 hours, with males earning 15 shillings, females 7, and children only 3 shillings for every day. During these long shifts, the workers were given but one break in which they were expected to eat lunch and clean their machines. Discipline within these factories was also terrible, which included such things as being beat with a leather belt and ears being nailed to tables. It was terribly harsh and a horrible place to work. However, life for the miners didn't get much better. Wages in the mines were very low, and you were paid by the amount of coal that you had in your tub. So, if you had no coal, you got no money. The mines were also an extremely dangerous place to work, with things like roof falls, drownings, and explosions happening far too often. Living in the city, however, was way worse than living in the country. The overpopulated cities were terribly polluted due to the massive amounts of coal being burned. People were forced to live in tight conditions, sometimes fitting a whole family into one room, and the crowded streets made diseases so easy to spread. It didn't help that there was a constant odor of human waste lingering in the air, because the water supply was terribly polluted. This made life in the city almost so uncomfortable. To make matters worse, the Combination Act of 1799 prohibited workers to unionize or combine as a group to fight for better working conditions. The government instituted these laws because they were kind of fearful of industry and social democracy. Not to mention, there was some snobbery involved in keeping the social pyramid. Trade unions were now formed, which was made up of mostly working people who aimed to improve and advance the interests of its members in the workplace. They believed that these unions would serve a broad network of needs to ensure fair treatment within the workplace. There were many laws that were thought up during the Industrial Revolution, some of which including the Health and Morals of Apprentice Act and the Factories Act, which fought for a limiting amount of hours to be worked and an age and limit to be working, but they were both overruled. One of the few laws that did get enforced was the Factories and Workshops Act, which addressed things like laws on safety, laws on ventilation, laws on mealtime. It also stated that no woman could work over than 60 hours a week, and no child was able to work if he was under 10 years old. Robert Owen was one of the most well-known utopian socialists. He bought 4 cotton mills in a small town called New Landmark. Owen helped his workers and ensured that they were all very well educated, that they had houses of their own, and that they all had access to doctors and physicians. Owen also established a nursery to keep the children protected while their mothers were working. Owen succeeded in this way of life, and his utopian ideas spread all across Europe, proving that factories could make people happy while still making a good profit. During the Industrial Revolution, educational issues improved as well. In 1880, the Education Act made it mandatory that children would attend public schooling until they are 10 years old. In 1918, they bumped this age up to 14 years. Finally, in 1944, they moved the mandatory age of schooling to 18 years. All of these things took place some 150 years after the start of the Industrial Revolution, and here we are today.